The coffee pot was half empty when the men in tailored suits kicked the diner doors open, guns already drawn. They expected the bleeding mob boss in the corner booth to die quietly. They didn't expect the fat waitress in the stained apron to pick up a Glock and shoot first. The neon sign in the window of the Starlight Diner had a short in the letter O. It buzzed. A low, electric wasp hum that had been driving Sadie slowly insane since her shift started at 10 o'clock. It was 3:14 a.m. The witching hour in the city, where the only people awake were the ones who were paid to be, or the ones who were up to no good. Sadie fell into the former category. She leaned heavily against the back counter, closing her eyes and shifting her weight off her left foot. Her heavy, rubber-soled work shoes offered zero support. Sadie was a big woman. She carried her weight in her broad hips, thick thighs, and a soft, rounded stomach that the cheap polyester of her uniform stubbornly clung to. She knew exactly how much space she took up in the world, mostly because the world never stopped reminding her. The narrow aisle behind the diner's counter forced her to turn sideways to let the line cook pass. The apron strings cut tight into her waist, the knot a solid pressure against her spine. She was exhausted. A bone-deep, cynical exhaustion that settled into her joints after 8 years of slinging bad coffee to drunks and insomniacs. The bell above the door chimed. Sadie didn't open her eyes immediately. She took a breath that tasted like burnt grease and old bleach, then opened them, pasting on a look of mild, professional apathy. The man who walked in didn't belong in the Starlight Diner. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat over a tailored suit. Even under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, the wool looked expensive. But he wasn't walking with the arrogant stride of a Wall Street trader who had taken a wrong turn. He was leaning heavily to his right. His left arm was pressed tight against his ribs. He didn't look around. He made a straight, uneven line for the last booth in the back, sliding into the red vinyl seat with a barely audible hiss of pain. Sadie grabbed a stained menu and a steaming pot of decaf. She walked over, her steps solid and heavy, the linoleum squeaking beneath her weight. As she approached, the metallic, copper scent hit her before she even saw it. The man was staring straight ahead. His face was all sharp angles and bruised shadows, pale to the point of grey. His dark hair was slicked back, but a few strands had fallen across his forehead, damp with cold sweat. Underneath his left hand, dark crimson was slowly seeping into the expensive wool of his coat, threatening to drip onto the cracked vinyl seat. Sadie stopped at the edge of the table. She looked at him. He looked up at her. His eyes were dark, flat, and remarkably calm for a man who was actively leaking life onto her clean floor. "Menu?" Sadie asked, her voice dry. "Coffee," he rasped. His voice was gravel, catching in his throat. "Black, please." Sadie didn't scream. She didn't panic. Panic was for people who had the luxury of someone else swooping in to save them. Sadie just felt a deep, irritating surge of annoyance. "You're bleeding on the upholstery, buddy," she said, pouring the dark liquid into a thick ceramic mug. "I have to scrub that with bleach if it stains." The man blinked. He looked down at his side, then back up at her, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through the mask of pain. Most people ran when they saw a man bleeding out from a gunshot wound in the middle of the night. "My apologies," he said softly. He reached into his right pocket with agonizing slowness. He pulled out a leather money clip and tossed a crumpled $100 bill onto the table. "For the cleaning fee," Sadie looked at the bill. Then she looked at his face. "Coffee is $2.50. I don't have change for $100. Keep it. I'm not a bank, and I'm not a hospital," Sadie said, resting the heavy coffee pot on the table. "Do I need to call an ambulance? Or the cops?" "Neither." His jaw tightened as a fresh wave of pain hit him. "Just the coffee, and maybe some ice, if you have it." Sadie stared at him for a long, quiet moment. He wasn't a random mugging victim. You didn't wear a $3,000 suit and bleed out in a diner without being wrapped up in something deep and ugly. She knew the neighborhood. She knew the kind of ghosts that haunted the streets after 2 a.m. "Don't die in the booth," she said finally. "The paperwork is a nightmare." She turned and walked her heavy, rolling gait back behind the counter. She scooped crushed ice into a clean dish towel, twisted it tight, and walked back to the booth. She dropped the makeshift ice pack onto the table. "Press that against it," she ordered. He took the towel, his large calloused hand brushing her knuckles. His skin was freezing. "Thank you. I'm Victor. Sadie." She grabbed the empty sugar caddies from the next table. "Drink your coffee, Victor. Then you're leaving. I don't want any trouble in my diner." "Neither do I, Sadie," Victor breathed, pressing the ice to his side and closing his eyes. "Neither do I." 30 minutes passed. The diner remained completely empty, save for the hum of the broken neon sign and the heavy rhythmic thud of Sadie's shoes as she wiped down the pie case. Victor hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still in the back booth, his head resting against the glass of the window, eyes half open, watching the street. The coffee in front of him had stopped steaming. Sadie was just thinking about telling him to leave when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a pressure drop. The hairs on her forearms stood up. A black SUV pulled up onto the curb outside, the headlights cutting through the diner's blinds and throwing long, violent shadows across the checkered floor. The engine cut out. Victor sat up. The sudden movement made him wince, but the lethargy was gone. His eyes were suddenly sharp, calculating, terrified animal focus. He reached into the right side of his coat, pulling a heavy, matte black handgun from a shoulder holster. His hand was shaking badly. Blood loss. Sadie froze behind the counter, a damp rag clutched in her hand. "Hey," she warned, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "No guns in here." Victor didn't look at her. "Get down, Sadie, now!" The diner doors didn't chime. They crashed open, the glass rattling violently in the frames. 4 men walked in. They moved with a terrifying synchronization. No shouting, no wild swinging. They fanned out across the diner, silencing the room with their presence. They wore dark jackets, and 3 of them had suppressed pistols already drawn, the long black barrels pointing toward the back booth. The man in the center, taller than the rest, wearing a tan trench coat, stepped forward. He had a scarred chin and dead, pale eyes. "Victor!" the man in the trench coat said. His voice was conversational, almost bored. "You lead us on a hell of a chase, all the way across town just to die in a greasy spoon?" Victor had his gun raised beneath the table, but he was pinned. 3 guns on him. He was losing blood fast, his reflexes shot. "Go to hell, Miller," Victor spat out, the words lacking their usual bite due to his ragged breathing. Miller smiled. He raised his weapon. Victor tried to bring his gun up above the table edge. He was too slow. Put crack. The suppressed gunshot was loud, a sharp, violent whip crack that echoed off the linoleum. The bullet clipped Victor's right wrist. Victor grunted in pain. His hand opened involuntarily. The heavy black handgun slipped from his grip. It clattered onto the floor and slid across the smooth linoleum, spinning twice before stopping dead against the rubber toe of Sadie's left shoe. Sadie looked down. The metal was dark and heavy against her white shoelaces. "Well," Miller sighed, shaking his head. "That's disappointing. I thought you'd put up more of a fight." Miller's eyes drifted away from Victor for a fraction of a second. He noticed Sadie standing behind the counter, her broad frame perfectly still. "Hey, big girl," Miller called out, waving the barrel of his gun lazily in her direction. "Do yourself a favor. Crawl into the kitchen and put your face on the floor. If I see so much as a shadow move, I'm putting a bullet in your heavy ass. Understand?" The other men chuckled, a low, cruel sound. Sadie didn't move. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, caged bird trapped in her chest. She looked at the men. She looked at their cold eyes, the casual way they held their weapons. They were professionals, cleaners, and cleaners didn't leave witnesses. They weren't going to let her walk out of here. Not after seeing their faces. They were going to shoot Victor. And then they were going to shoot her, leaving her to bleed out next to the deep fryer. The realization didn't come with a wave of hysterical panic. It came with a profound, icy clarity. Society had taught Sadie her entire life that she was weak, soft, slow, punchline to a joke. But she survived the graveyard shift in the worst part of town for a decade. She hauled 50-pound bags of flour, broke up knife fights between truckers, and stood on her feet for 12 hours a day. She wasn't weak. She was a tank. She was solid mass, bone, and anger. Victor was clutching his bleeding wrist, staring at the men in front of him, waiting for the end. Miller aimed right at Victor's chest. "Say goodnight, boss." Sadie didn't think. She moved. She dropped into a squat, her thick thighs absorbing her weight perfectly. Her hand clamped around the grip of Victor's gun. It was heavy, much heavier than the revolver her dad used to let her shoot at cans in the woods. But the mechanics were the same. She stood up, ignoring the burning in her knees. She didn't cower. She planted her feet wide, settling her low center of gravity, gripping the gun with both hands. Miller's finger tightened on his trigger. He didn't even see her move. Sadie raised the gun, leveled its center mass at Miller's tan trench coat, and squeezed the trigger. The noise in the diner was apocalyptic. Victor's gun wasn't suppressed. The muzzle flash illuminated the dark diner in a brilliant, violent stroke of lightning. The recoil slammed back into Sadie's palms, traveling up her wrists, but her heavy frame absorbed it like a shock absorber. She barely swayed. The bullet struck Miller square in the chest. The force of the hollow point lifted him entirely off his feet, throwing him backward into the front pastry display. The glass shattered outward in a spectacular explosion of crumbs and jagged shards. Time stopped. The three remaining gunmen froze, their brains failing to process the impossible geometry of what just happened. The bleeding mob boss hadn't shot their leader. The fat waitress behind the counter, holding a smoking gun with a terrifyingly steady grip, had. Sadie didn't wait for them to figure it out. Her ears were ringing, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. But survival instinct was screaming in her ear. She racked the slide, something she had seen in movies, hoping to God she did it right, and swung the heavy barrel toward the second man. "Get down!" she screamed, her voice tearing through her throat, not at Victor, but at the gunman. But they didn't get down. Their shock broke. The man on the left raised his weapon toward her. Sadie didn't hesitate. She fired again. Bang. The second man pitched forward, clutching his leg as the bullet shattered his kneecap. He hit the linoleum, screaming. The remaining two gunmen scattered. One dove behind the nearest booth, knocking over a tray of empty ketchup bottles. The other backpedaled frantically toward the shattered front door, firing blindly in Sadie's direction. A bullet punched through the coffee machine beside Sadie's head, spraying her with scalding water and hissing steam. She flinched, turning her broad shoulder to protect her face, ducking hard below the laminate counter. Silence descended on the diner, save for the hissing steam, the groans of the man on the floor, and the buzzing of the broken neon R. Sadie sat on the greasy floor mats, her chest heaving, the hot metal of the gun pressed tight against her apron. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking so hard she could barely maintain her grip. From the back booth, a low, stunned voice drifted over the noise. "Jesus Christ," Victor whispered. Sadie leaned her head back against the cabinets, squeezed her eyes shut, and let out a shaky breath. "I told you," she panted, her voice trembling but thick with adrenaline. "No guns in my diner." The hissing of the espresso machine sounded like a dying snake. Sadie stayed curled beneath the stainless steel counter, the cold linoleum biting into her knees, the sour smell of old mop water mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of cordite. Her ears rang, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the traffic on the street outside. "Waitress!" Victor's voice was barely a rasp, drifting from the back booth. Sadie swallowed hard, tasting bile and adrenaline. "It's Sadie!" she hissed back, not moving an inch. "Sadie," Victor corrected, his voice tight with agony. "The one behind the booth. He's reloading. You have maybe 3 seconds before he flanks you." Panic spiked in her chest, sharp and cold. She looked down at the gun in her hands. The slide was still forward. It was heavy, hot steel smelling of burnt powder. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, though she knew Victor couldn't hear her over the ringing. Heavy boots crunched on broken glass. The gunman was moving. He wasn't rushing. He was pacing it out, creeping along the far side of the counter where the pie case usually blocked the view. "Fat bitch!" the man yelled, his voice cracking with rage and fear. "I'm gonna gut you! I'm gonna put you down like a hog!" The insult didn't make her cry. It didn't make her shrink. After a lifetime of hearing every variation of it, the words just made her deeply, profoundly exhausted. And then the exhaustion mutated into a hot, blinding rage. She wasn't dying on the floor of a diner that paid her $9 an hour. Sadie didn't try to crawl. Her knees were already bruised, and she wasn't built for stealth. She used the heavy handle of the lowboy refrigerator to haul herself up. As she rose, her hand brushed the commercial coffee station. Sitting on the burner, piping hot and untouched, was a full-glass carafe of the diner's darkest roast. Footsteps squeaked on the grease-stained floor right at the edge of the counter. Sadie dropped the gun onto the cutting board. With both hands, she grabbed the handle of the boiling carafe. The gunman rounded the corner, his suppressed pistol raised. His eyes were wide, expecting to find her cowering on the floor. Instead, he found a woman who stood 5'10", solidly built, blocking the narrow aisle like a brick wall. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, adjusting his aim upward. Sadie swung the carafe. She didn't throw the liquid. She drove the thick glass bottom directly into his face with the heavy, unyielding momentum of her entire upper body. The impact was a sickening crunch of cartilage and shattering glass. A gallon of 200-degree coffee washed over the man's face, neck, and chest. He shrieked, a raw, high-pitched wail of pure agony. His hands flew to his scalded eyes, dropping his weapon. He stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the slick mixture of fresh coffee and blood. Sadie didn't pause to watch him fall. She snatched Victor's heavy gun off the cutting board, gripped it with both hands, leveled it at the man's chest as he flailed, and pulled the trigger. The recoil shoved her back, but her wide stance absorbed it. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him violently before he crashed into the swinging kitchen doors and crumpled to the floor, motionless. Silence slammed back into the room. Sadie kept the gun raised, her chest heaving. Sweat poured down the sides of her face, cutting tracks through the dusting of powdered sugar and grit on her cheeks. She turned her head slowly, checking the front door. The fourth man, the one who had backpedaled out the door, was gone. Through the shattered front windows, Sadie watched the tail lights of the black SUV tear away from the curb, burning rubber as it ran a red light and vanished into the city grid. She lowered the gun. Her arms felt like they were made of lead. She stood alone in the wreckage of the Starlight Diner. The pastry case was obliterated, cherry pie filling mingling with Miller's blood on the checkered tiles. The second gunman was unconscious in a pool of his own making near the jukebox. The third lay wedged in the kitchen doors. Sadie let out a long, shuddering breath. She felt the sudden, terrifying urge to laugh. She clamped a hand over her mouth, biting her lip until she tasted copper, forcing the hysteria back down into the dark place where she kept everything else. She stepped over the shattered glass, her heavy rubber soles gripping the floor perfectly, and walked back to the corner booth. Victor was slouched sideways against the vinyl, his eyes closed. The makeshift towel she had given him was soaked completely through, a heavy mass of dark red. Sadie dropped the gun onto the laminate table. It landed with a heavy, final clunk. Victor's eyes fluttered open. He looked at the gun, then slowly dragged his gaze up to her face. He took in her stained apron, the smear of soot on her cheek, the steady, unblinking way she looked back at him. "They're gone," Sadie said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. 3 down, 1 ran. Victor coughed, a wet sound that rattled in his chest. You didn't dump the magazine." "I don't even know what that means," Sadie said, sliding into the booth opposite him. She reached across the table, grabbed the bloody towel, and pressed it hard against his side. Victor grunted, his jaw clenching, but he didn't pull away. "It means you didn't run out of bullets." He swallowed hard. "Where did you learn to shoot?" "I didn't. I just pointed it at the guys who were trying to kill me." She pressed harder, leaning her weight into her palms. "You need a hospital, Victor. You're grey. No hospitals," he breathed, his head lolling against the glass. "Cops ask questions. Miller was a problem. Now he's not. But the police won't see it that way." "I just shot 3 men," Sadie said, the reality of it finally starting to seep into her bones. Her hands began to shake again, trembling against his side. "I killed a man in my diner." Victor reached out with his good hand, his fingers, cold and smeared with his own blood, wrapped around her thick wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Look at me, Sadie." She looked up. "You didn't kill a man," Victor said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with absolute, terrifying sincerity. "You killed a rabid dog that kicked down your door. You defended your territory." He let out a breathless, pained chuckle. "You stood your ground. Most men I know would have pissed themselves and died under that counter." "You planted your feet." Sadie looked away, her throat tight. "I'm just big. It's hard to miss me." "Being heavy didn't pull the trigger," Victor said softly. "You did. You're a tank, Sadie. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." For the first time in years, someone was acknowledging her size, not as a punchline, not as a moral failing, but as a fact. A tactical advantage. She had anchored herself to the earth when the world exploded, and she had survived. Headlights swept across the diner. Sadie tensed, grabbing for the gun on the table, but Victor weakly pushed her hand down. "Mine," he whispered. 2 sleek black town cars pulled up to the curb. 4 men got out. They didn't wear trench coats. They wore dark suits, moving with quiet, urgent efficiency. 2 of them jogged into the diner, their eyes scanning the carnage, stepping over Miller's body without a second glance. They reached the booth. "Mr. Vance," the older of the 2 men said, his eyes briefly flickering to Sadie with concealed shock. "We need to move." "Yeah," Victor rasped. He looked at Sadie. "Let go." Sadie pulled her hands back. They were covered in his blood. The men hauled Victor up, supporting his weight between them. He groaned, his face twisting in pain, but he stayed upright. They started to walk him toward the door. "Wait," Victor said, stopping them. He reached into the inside pocket of his ruined overcoat with his good hand. He pulled out a thick, folded bundle of bills held together by a thick rubber band. He tossed it onto the table. It landed in the puddle of spilled coffee. "For the cleaning fee," Victor said. Sadie stared at the brick of cash. It had to be $50,000. Maybe more. "Victor," Sadie said, her voice finally trembling. "What am I supposed to tell the cops?" Victor offered her a tight, bloody smile. "Tell them a man named Miller came in to rob the register. Tell them he slipped on a wet floor and his gun went off. By the time my men are done in here, the police won't find a single shell casing or a drop of blood that doesn't belong to him." He nodded to the other men in the diner. They were already dragging the wounded gunman out the back door, tossing weapons into a canvas bag. "And the others?" she asked. "There are no others," Victor said softly. "You saved my life tonight, Sadie. The Starlight Diner is under my protection now. Forever." They carried him out into the night. Sadie stood in the empty diner. The cleanup crew worked like ghosts, scrubbing the linoleum, hauling out the bodies, wiping down the counters. Within 10 minutes, they were gone. The only evidence that anything had happened was the shattered pastry case and the smell of bleach masking the copper scent of blood. Sadie walked slowly behind the counter. She turned on the cold water in the industrial sink and stuck her hands under the stream, watching the dark red wash down the stainless steel drain. Above her head, the neon sign in the window buzzed. The short in the letter R finally gave out, plunging the front half of the diner into shadow. Sadie dried her hands on her apron, walked over to the table, and picked up the brick of cash. She shoved it deep into her apron pocket. Then she grabbed a rag, walked over to the broken pastry case, and started to clean up the glass. Her shift wasn't over until 6. The diner is quiet, but the story is just beginning. What happens when the criminal underworld realizes the most dangerous person in the city is a graveyard shift waitress who refuses to take their garbage? If you want to see Sadie navigate the dark, violent world she just blew a hole into, drop a like, hit that share button, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments if you think Victor owes her more than just a tip.